this episode, we bring Domain 2 together and turn a long stretch of ideas into one clear review that helps you hear what this part of the certification is really trying to teach. By the time a learner reaches a review point, it is easy to feel that many useful terms have passed by without always settling into one connected picture, especially when topics like scenarios, impacts, vulnerabilities, analysis methods, and registers all seem important in slightly different ways. The best way to review this domain is not to treat it as a stack of separate definitions, but as a single way of thinking about how organizations understand technology-related exposure before deciding what to do about it. The Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control (CRISC) perspective wants you to become the kind of person who can connect business objectives, plausible harmful events, evidence, control weakness, and business consequence into one disciplined judgment. When that logic becomes clear, Domain 2 feels much less like memorization and much more like a process for seeing risk in a way that leadership can actually use. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The biggest takeaway from Domain 2 is that risk assessment is not about collecting technical facts for their own sake. It is about helping the organization understand how uncertainty could interfere with important business objectives and how serious that exposure may be under current conditions. That means the domain is always trying to connect a possible event to real business harm rather than stopping at a system flaw or a general security concern. A weak review of risk says a control is missing or a vulnerability exists, but a strong review explains what could happen, what that would affect, why it matters, and how the business should think about the remaining exposure. This is one of the most important ideas to carry into the exam, because the best answer is usually the one that links technical reality to business impact and decision-making rather than the one that sounds the most detailed from a technical point of view. Domain 2 is really teaching you how to move from observation to judgment in a disciplined and business-aware way. A second major lesson is the difference between identifying a risk event and merely spotting a weakness. Domain 2 keeps returning to the idea that a risk event is a meaningful occurrence or condition that could affect the organization's objectives, not just a flaw sitting quietly in isolation. A scanner finding, a poor process, or a weak approval step can all matter, but the exam often wants you to think one step further and ask what harmful event could grow from that weakness if conditions line up the wrong way. This matters because risk becomes easier to assess when it is described in a form that shows cause and effect instead of remaining a vague technical concern. The strongest students learn to ask what could actually happen, who or what would be affected, and what business function or outcome is at stake if the event becomes real. When you review Domain 2 through that lens, event identification becomes the bridge between scattered problems and meaningful analysis, because it turns raw weakness into something leaders can prioritize, compare, and act upon. Contributing conditions are just as important as the event itself, and this is an area where Domain 2 becomes deeper than many beginners expect. Serious business harm usually does not emerge from one dramatic failure that appears out of nowhere. Much more often, it grows from several conditions working together, such as weak visibility, unclear ownership, inconsistent control operation, fragile dependencies, staffing pressure, or slow detection and recovery capability. The exam likes this kind of thinking because it reflects reality more accurately than the idea that a single flaw explains everything. If you hear a scenario involving repeated exceptions, poor coordination, aging systems, vendor dependence, or weak monitoring, you should immediately start thinking about contributing conditions rather than only about the obvious symptom that is being described. That mindset matters in practice as well, because organizations improve more effectively when they understand the environment shaping a risk event instead of treating each problem as random bad luck. Domain 2 wants you to recognize patterns, not just individual defects. Another key takeaway is that impact analysis is where technical concerns become business concerns. A risk event matters because of what it can cost in money, operations, time, trust, legal exposure, customer confidence, or strategic momentum. The exam does not want you to admire impact as an abstract category. It wants you to understand that organizations make better decisions when likely loss results and wider business consequences are described clearly enough to compare one risk against another. This means you should always think past the initial event and ask what the downstream effect would be if the event succeeded or lasted longer than expected. A short disruption in one area may be survivable, while a similar disruption in a customer-facing or regulated process may become severe very quickly. Domain 2 teaches you to look at direct loss, indirect loss, cascading consequences, timing, and stakeholder effect, because impact is not just a label. It is the business meaning of the event, and without that meaning, the assessment is incomplete. Threat modeling and awareness of the threat landscape add an important outside view to this domain, because risk assessment cannot rely only on internal assumptions about what feels dangerous. The organization has to consider the broader environment around it, including malicious actors, criminal patterns, insider misuse, operational mistakes, environmental disruption, and the way new technologies or business dependencies change exposure over time. At the same time, the exam will usually reward answers that apply this outside view to the organization's specific situation rather than chasing every public headline equally. A threat matters most when it is relevant to the business model, the critical services, the sensitive data, and the real pathways to harm in the environment being assessed. That is why threat modeling is so valuable. It forces you to ask what the organization values, who or what could affect it, how that harm could unfold, and what business result would follow if the threat succeeds. Domain 2 is teaching you to use the wider threat picture as context, not as noise. Vulnerability and control deficiency analysis deepen that thinking even further by asking why the exposure exists and why it has not already been reduced. A vulnerability is a meaningful weakness, while a control deficiency tells you that the safeguards or oversight meant to reduce exposure are missing, weak, incomplete, outdated, or not working consistently in practice. Root cause analysis, or RCA, takes the next step by asking why those conditions were allowed to exist and persist in the first place. This is one of the best examples of Domain 2 pushing you beneath the surface. A compromised account, failed change, or data error may be the visible problem, but the deeper lessons often involve weak governance, poor review discipline, unclear accountability, insufficient investment, or a culture that normalizes exceptions. The exam often rewards the answer that addresses the underlying condition rather than the one that only treats the immediate symptom. That is a valuable real-world habit as well, because shallow fixes create repeated failure, while deeper analysis gives the organization a chance to reduce recurrence. Risk scenario development is one of the most practical skills in the domain because it pulls separate ideas into a single, credible picture of how harm could unfold. A good scenario is not a dramatic story written to frighten people, and it is not a vague statement that something bad could happen someday. It is a structured description of a plausible event, the conditions that support it, the asset or process affected, and the likely business consequences if the event succeeds or continues. This is useful on the exam because questions often present fragments of risk information and expect you to recognize the business situation those fragments imply. Strong scenario thinking helps you connect the threat, the weakness, the control environment, and the consequence into one chain instead of treating them as unrelated facts. It also improves your ability to compare risk, because two findings that look similar on paper may produce very different scenarios depending on timing, dependency, customer effect, and recovery difficulty. Domain 2 wants you to hear those differences clearly. Another important review point is that concepts, standards, frameworks, methodologies, and tools exist to make analysis more consistent, not to create paperwork for its own sake. Risk assessment becomes weak when each team uses different definitions, different criteria, different assumptions about seriousness, and different ways of presenting evidence. Recognized approaches give the organization common language, a repeatable structure, and a way to explain how risk is being assessed across systems, processes, business units, and third parties, while supporting methods such as workshops, matrices, scoring guides, interviews, and scenario analysis help teams apply that structure to real situations. The exam does not usually care whether you can recite every framework detail from memory. It cares much more about whether you understand why context, scope, criteria, analysis, evaluation, and documentation matter in a discipline process, and why the selected method should fit the business question being answered. A method is useful only if it helps the organization compare exposures, explain assumptions, and support decision-making. Domain 2 uses both frameworks and tools to organize judgment, not to replace judgment with ritual. The information technology, IT, risk register is another central takeaway because it turns risk from a meeting conversation into a managed business record. A mature register is not just a pile of technical issues, and it is not simply a compliance artifact built to satisfy a reviewer. It is the structured memory of the risk program, where meaningful exposures are described, owned, tracked, compared, reviewed, and connected to decisions about response and acceptance. This matters on the exam because a strong register entry reflects clear business language, ownership at the right level, and enough context that the risk can be understood over time rather than forgotten after a single discussion. It also matters because the register supports governance by showing patterns, concentrations, repeated weaknesses, and areas where exposure remains open longer than leadership should tolerate. When reviewing Domain 2, remember that a risk does not become manageable just because someone notices it. It becomes more manageable when it is recorded well enough to stay visible, comparable, and tied to accountable action. Business impact analysis, BIA, is one of the clearest examples of this business-centered mindset. It asks which functions matter most, how disruption affects them, how quickly that effect becomes serious, and what supporting resources must be restored or protected first. That is why ABIA begins with business functions and dependencies rather than only with technology components. The exam often uses this topic to test whether you understand the difference between technical recovery and business priority. A system may be important, but the real question is what business process depends on it, what obligations or revenue streams are tied to that process, and how long the organization can tolerate disruption before harm becomes unacceptable. The strongest answer will usually be the one that reflects actual business criticality instead of assuming every system deserves equal urgency. Domain 2 uses the BIA to teach that resilience planning becomes much stronger when the organization knows what matters most, how timing changes severity, and where recovery attention should go first under pressure. The distinction between inherent risk and residual risk is another theme you should carry into the exam with great clarity, because it shows whether you can separate natural exposure from the exposure that remains after controls are considered. Inherent risk is the level attached to the activity, the data, the process, or the dependency before you give credit to the current control environment. Residual risk is what remains after the actual controls, oversight, monitoring, and response capability are taken into account honestly. This distinction matters because the exam often expects you to recognize whether a question is asking about the basic seriousness of the activity or the remaining seriousness after safeguards have done their work. It also matters because many poor decisions happen when people assume that the existence of any control automatically means the residual position must be low. Domain 2 teaches you to ask whether the controls are strong enough, broad enough, and consistently operated enough to reduce the remaining exposure to a level leadership can responsibly accept. As you shift from content review into exam thinking, one of the best habits is to read each question as a business judgment problem instead of as a trivia question. Pay very close attention to whether the STEM is asking for the best action, the first action, the most important concern, the most likely cause, or the most useful next step. These phrases matter because the correct answer in CRISC often depends on sequence, ownership, and business context rather than on a purely technical move. When two answers seem plausible, ask which one better clarifies the risk, supports decision-making, respects governance, reflects business impact, or addresses the deeper cause instead of only the visible symptom. Also pay close attention to whether the problem described is really about event identification, impact assessment, control weakness, scenario development, prioritization, or ownership, because many wrong answers become tempting when you solve the wrong problem. Domain 2 rewards calm interpretation, not speed-driven guessing, and strong students stay anchored to the business purpose of the assessment from the first word of the question to the last. By the end of this review, Domain 2 should feel much more unified than it might have felt when you first moved through the individual lessons. It is really about learning how to assess technology-related risk in a structured way by identifying meaningful events, understanding contributing conditions, analyzing business impact, considering the threat environment, examining weaknesses and control gaps, building scenarios, using disciplined methods, recording risk clearly, understanding business criticality, and distinguishing natural exposure from remaining exposure after controls. Every topic in the domain helps move the organization from vague concern toward clearer judgment. That is why this domain matters so much in CRISC and why it often feels so practical once the pieces connect. When you walk into the exam with that integrated view, you are much less likely to be distracted by narrow technical detail or confusing wording. You will hear the deeper question underneath the scenario, and that is the point where better answers, stronger judgment, and more confident risk thinking begin to come together.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.